If you could rewind the clock and go back to the day you were born, and you could choose, if you could tell the doctor, hey, give me a really high IQ, or give me a really low IQ, make me really smart, or make me a little bit dim, obviously you'd choose to be really smart. Intellectual power, processing power between your ears, it's probably going to play out pretty well whether you're a doctor or a school teacher, whether you're a stay-at-home parent, or whether you're a politician. It's probably going to be helpful no matter what you're doing. And the statistics in terms of career success, they track along with this hypothesis. But what it doesn't really take into account is the stuff of life that maybe matters more, like how do you do in your relationships? How do you do socially? How do you do with friends? Does anyone at work actually like you, right? And this is the intelligence trap. When we put intelligence on a pedestal and we think of someone like Steve Jobs as God, when it just takes a few minutes and a little bit of reading of biographies to realize that guy had a whole bunch of things that were pretty off kilter. On this week's podcast, we'll be talking about the intelligence trap on a nuanced level, the different traps that people fall into. And it doesn't matter if you have an average IQ or you're a genius or you're a little bit on the low end. All of us can still fall into these traps when we think about intelligence in the wrong way. If you're new here, it's the Lucas Rockwood Show. I'm your host. I'm a yoga teacher, a trainer. I'm a serial entrepreneur, but mostly I'm just a student. I like to learn stuff, so I go out into the world of health and wellness, personal growth and development, and I try to find people writing books, doing research, doing important work that can hopefully help you live a more fulfilled life. If you'd like to write into the show, send me a voicemail. Actually, that's even better. Go to yogabody.com/Ask Lucas. And if you like this show, the best way to support me is simply to share the show on social and tag me. It's at Lucas Rockwood. Thanks for listening. Enjoy. So hello and welcome everyone. Today's show is called The Intelligence Trap, and I am joined here with David Robson. David is a science writer. He's based in London, and he specializes in brains, bodies, and behavior. He was the features editor at New Science for 5 years. He's currently a senior journalist at BBC Future. He regularly features on BBC World Service, and his writing has appeared in The Guardian, The Atlantic, The Washington Post. He's got a new book called The Intelligence Trap we'll be chatting about today. David, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
So how did you get interested in this specifically? Did you grow up like a gifted kid, or did you have an older brother who was super smart who drove you crazy, or what sparked your interest in this?
So in England, we have to take these intelligence tests at the age of 11 to decide which senior school we go to. So, I passed that, but, the tests at the time always seemed a bit arbitrary to me. It was quite abstract. So I guess I'd always wondered how do we define intelligence and what does that really mean based on those kinds of problems. But then, it was actually when I started working at New Scientist magazine that I became really interested in this question of why smart people could act stupidly. Because I would interview some of the greatest minds really around, and, their achievements were undoubtedly the work of genius. Some of these people had won Nobel Prizes, and it's just amazing how they could have improved our understanding of the mind or the universe in that way. But I would also hear just some really bizarre stories of, mistakes in their personal lives or their beliefs outside of their area of expertise. So one example was this guy, Paul Frampton, who I fell for this honey trap scheme where he was online dating, and then he, was eventually persuaded to carry 2 kilograms of cocaine across the Argentinian border. Or there was Kerry Mullis, who won the Nobel Prize, and then he was an AIDS denialist and a climate change denialist. So I just wondered how can we tally that with our understanding of intelligence? Surely general intelligence should be by definition general and should allow you to be more rational in all areas of your life. But as I dug deeper, I found that wasn't true, actually. The intelligence and rationality and wisdom are very separate entities.
And so in the U.S. we have standardized tests. I don't know what they use now, but I grew up taking something called Iowa Basics, and then we take SATs obviously, and you guys do A levels, I assume, and and people do other things. They do IQ tests and aptitude tests. And what I'm getting at here is what in your research and your writing and things like this, how much stock should someone put in tests like that? Are they all terribly flawed, or do they give us some insight? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say they're like terribly flawed, and I think they're actually quite effective at measuring what they kind of originally set out to measure. And that is this kind of abstract reasoning, which determines how good you are at maths, say, or your kind of capacity to learn quickly and to process complex information, which is so important for, whether you're like a literature student studying, I don't know, like Middlemarch by George Eliot, or if you're a physicist looking at the theory of general relativity, they both require that kind of abstract mind, that kind of processing power. So they're really good at measuring that kind of basic capacity to kind of understand and process complex information. My point with the intelligence trap is more that is like the kind of engine of a car. That's the kind of basic power behind the wheels. But, just as with a car, you need like good steering or good brakes or GPS to help you navigate correctly. Similarly, you need like these other kinds of checks and balances to make sure you apply your intelligence correctly. Otherwise, you can sometimes use that intelligence to just amplify your own errors and to justify your mistakes. So that's really the point I'm getting at here, is that we shouldn't like completely disregard the kind of measures of intelligence we've used before, but we need to expand them and to kind of consider these other qualities.
I grew up in gifted programs, and I always had special teachers in special schools and all these kinds of things. And in my social circles, I was in academic social circles, and so we valued, the coolest kid in class was the brightest kid, the smartest kid, the kid he just had the most processing power in his head, basically. And that's kind of a unique experience, and I grew up just thinking that was the ticket to success, and it really wasn't. I mean, we could sit here and I could tell you stories for 3 hours about all the smartest people I know who are just total messes in their life, and can't say they've done great financially, can't say they've done great in emotional, like in their relationships and things like this. And when I kind of got thrown out of that, I grew up in these bubbles. Even though I was in public schools most of the time, I was still in this bubble where I was with the smartest kids in my town, and that's a very different experience than being in a normal society. And I kind of assumed we were all on the fast track to success. Anyways, I got thrown out into the real world, and I started working for people who were, I don't know how to say this tactfully, so I'll just say it bluntly, they were objectively less smart than me, and they were way more successful, like way more successful. I remember I worked in New York City, and I worked for this publisher, and she was not a smart woman, and I could never wrap my head around how high, what a high level she performed at. She outperformed people with twice her processing power, and I just couldn't. It really was a slap in the face for me, because I grew up in an environment where we just thought the smartest kid would win, the smartest kid would get into the best school, and the best school would get the best job. And here I was, I'm working on Lower Broadway in Manhattan, and this woman is not bright, and she's extremely well liked, extremely successful, and I wouldn't say in spite of herself. She just figured she had other skills, and so I guess that obviously I'm sure you've run into this in your research as well. How do you think about, like, does intelligence even matter? Like, is it even useful if somebody can cram a bunch of math problems, or if they can understand molecular biology? Like, is that even useful?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that raises a really interesting point. And, it's something I've come across in my own kind of career path, as well as them researching the book. And, I mean, so I'd definitely say, like, there is the advantage to being intelligent and having that processing power. So, but I'd say it's not as big an advantage as we'd expected. And that kind of fits with the experience you're describing. And so one of the best frameworks, I think, to understand that particular story would be this theory by this man called Robert Sternberg, who talks about 3 kinds of intelligence. So one is analytical intelligence, which is basically that kind of information processing that we talked about, so the kind of abstract thinking. But then he also has made a lot of tests to study practical intelligence. And that's not quite the same thing as like common sense, or, like whether you can, I don't know, like program your video, or, that's quite archaic now. But you know what I mean? It's not just that kind of thing. It's also the kind of skills you were discussing about your boss in Manhattan, where, some people are just really effective at kind of reaching their goals because they're great at planning, they're great at like preempting the challenges they're going to face, and then finding like really innovative solutions around them. They're great with people and kind of knowing how to get the best out of people around them. And, you know, that actually doesn't correlate so well with the kind of analytical intelligence that we've spoken about. So you can be like really highly intelligent analytically, but actually lack a lot of these kind of basic, this basic practical intelligence. It also involves things like just kind of knowing how to prioritize tasks. And I remember coming into the workforce and being really surprised how like some really smart people just really struggled to kind of prioritize what jobs they needed to get done in the quickest way possible. So it's that kind of thing that I think is kind of neglected. And I think like in education at the moment, we just assume that a smart person is going to pick up all of those skills. But actually it's something that, you know, people reach the workforce and they're just not necessarily that good at. And maybe we need to think more about ways that we can help to cultivate those kinds of skills too.
My next question is intellect, are we at a place right now where intellect is valued? And the reason I ask that is because, you know, I see a lot of, you know, Kim Kardashian, social media stars, some of the people would argue that some of the most powerful people in the world right now don't seem to be demonstrating very, very high levels of intelligence. Like, is it even valued right now? I'm curious. Again, it's one of these things that I've really thought about a lot recently because it just doesn't seem to necessarily correlate with financial success, personal happiness, relationship stability, any of these things.
So I guess I have quite a nuanced answer to that. And I feel like intelligence is valued, but you have to make it look effortless. And what isn't valued is like the kind of intelligence where you're actually like actively trying to think and analyze a problem and recognize that it might be you're not kind of. It's a bit like the thing at school. It's like, I think in lots of schools, like, it's fine if you're like the smartest kid in your class, but you have to kind of pretend that you didn't do any studying to get to that point, you know. And I think we've kind of carried that on. So if you look at like Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the UK, you know, obviously like really intelligent. He studied classics at Oxford, but he almost cultivates this kind of like air of like buffoonery around himself. And then that becomes less threatening. And I think this is actually a serious problem because it means that kind of when we're looking at people's decision making, they're quite wary of showing too much kind of preparation or thought. And they're much more likely to just say they went, you know, for a decision based on like gut instinct. And it's more like how quickly you can come to a decision rather than going through the due process first. That's really respected now. And then I think that leads to a lot of these kind of big errors that you see. And it kind of contributes to those cognitive biases that people like Daniel Kahneman have studied. So it's a really bad way of thinking and a bad way of appreciating intelligence, when actually we should realize that even the smartest people sometimes have to work really hard to get to where they are.
And so what is the trap in simple terms? What is the trap of intelligence that people need to be aware of, the thesis of your book?
Yeah. So I think like if we return to that analogy of the car, then I think it's really this idea that you just kind of, you don't apply your intelligence correctly or with kind of good judgment or wisdom. And so there are 4 different ways that can happen. So the first is this concept called cognitive miserliness. It's miserliness in the way that you're not kind of spending your intelligence. You're just a lazy thinker. So these people just, like I mentioned just now, kind of rely too much on gut instinct, which often can be correct, but sometimes is really wrong. And they're just not really second-guessing their opinions or their decisions and not thinking about them carefully. So you can see that a lot with things like fake news, for instance, where really smart people can fall for fake news just because they read like the gist of a statement and it kind of makes sense with their worldview, but they don't really look at it carefully for the factual inaccuracies or the logical fallacies that might have led them there. So it's just not really thinking carefully. But the second one, and the one I think is most important, is this phenomenon called motivated reasoning. And that's much more of just a one-sided application of your brain power. And that's a danger when we feel like very emotionally attached to an idea. And it means that we can build like crazy rationalizations of our ideas and kind of use our intelligence to knock down any evidence to the contrary. And the more intelligent you are, the better you are at doing that. So the example I give in my book is this, the guy Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes books, who was clearly massively intelligent in the kind of traditional ways we would appraise intelligence. But he had these strange beliefs in, the paranormal and fairies. He thought that there were kind of these fairy beings that were kind of operating on a different wavelength. And he used his intelligence to kind of really create this whole elaborate theory of how they could exist, and to knock down the kind of opinions of the scientists and skeptics who were trying to argue with him. So in that way, his intelligence was actually just cementing this belief rather than helping him to look at it more rationally. And you see that a lot with climate change denialists and with issues like, gun control as well, or, any politically charged issue like Brexit in the UK, for instance, where people are just kind of using their intelligence to support their own point of view. And so it actually leads to greater polarization. And then the other forms of the intelligence trap, I'll just go through quickly. So one is, comes from expertise and is called Entrenchment. And that's just that the more experience you have in a job, the more kind of automatic your thinking becomes, and you actually become less flexible as a result. And then there's earned dogmatism. So that's the idea that if you have like a postgraduate degree in some subject, then you kind of know everything there is to know about that. And so you kind of become even more closed-minded. You've earned your dogmatism. So you can become polarized in your view, and you're not going to listen to any new evidence. And that can be quite dangerous, especially in something like politics, for instance, where the situation is constantly changing. So I'd say those are the four main mechanisms of the intelligence trap, and they can explain all kinds of phenomena from, the financial crash in 2008 to the Deepwater Horizon crisis to, serious miscarriages of justice and doctors' errors. So all of these kind of problems in so many diverse areas of life.
That earned dogmatism one really rings true for me. We've had, 350 guests on the show, and some of them are new experts and some of them are kind of old-time experts. And the trap that, certainly not all of them, but many old-time experts we do a lot of work with, health and nutrition specifically, is they have this earned dogmatism where they have really great research from the 80s and 90s, which it was great, it is great, but there's new information, and they're just they're so sold on, been there, done that, learned this, that really, really smart, extremely accomplished people, and they're just not looking at the new information. And it's one of my biggest fears. I'm in my 40s. I'm just worried that someday I'll just stop learning new things. And so that leads to my question: How do people stay away from this trap? How do they stay agile? How do they stay intelligent, and not just intellectually but emotionally and socially? How do you suggest people think about these things?
Yeah. That's a great question, and I totally identify with your kind of fear that you'll just stop learning and you'll become kind of too set in your ways, because that's something that bothers me as well. And so what you actually find is that you can measure the trait of curiosity quite scientifically now and quite accurately in the same ways that we could measure intelligence. And you do find that curious people who always want to kind of learn and discover new things, they're actually a lot less susceptible to the intelligence trap, especially that motivated reasoning. And it's because their kind of curiosity means that they, even if they are emotionally attached to an idea, if something contradicts that idea, that in itself is so innately fascinating that they'll kind of pursue the new information. So, like with those nutritionists that you're mentioning, or doctors, if they were like more genuinely curious and less attached to their own theories, they might just feel like a real buzz from finding out that there's this whole new idea they hadn't explored before. So I would say one of the best things is just to try to make sure you maintain your curiosity, because it really is something that you kind of, I think you use it or lose it, basically. And it's very easy kind of once you leave education to just kind of stop learning and stop appreciating the value of learning. But really to keep cultivating that, I think, is so important. But there are some other really simple strategies that you could apply straight away. And one of them that I really like is this phenomenon called, this strategy called self-distancing. And that is just the idea that if you feel really attached to an idea and you're feeling very emotional, you don't exactly want to numb those feelings completely, but you just want to kind of take a step back. And this arises from the observation, actually, that, when you look at someone's kind of decision-making process, they're much more rational when they talk about when they're discussing someone else's problems compared to their own, because they've got that slight emotional distance. And I think that's something we can all, realistically, for you to say, for me to say, for instance, David has this dilemma at work, this colleague is really annoying him and he doesn't know how to kind of reach a compromise, this is what he might do. And that just gives you that slight emotional distance that does seem to improve people's decision-making process. So it makes them less susceptible to bias and more open-minded and readier to kind of overcome that motivated reasoning.
Within the U.S., our university system has really come under attack, both from within academia and without. People saying that it's archaic, it's overpriced, that it's really exploiting people on all different levels, that it's biased, that it's a liberal think tank, that all these kinds of things. You come from in the UK, so I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of intelligence trap, education models, academia from an English perspective.
Well, I definitely wouldn't want to bash the value of higher education, because I think it is incredibly important. But I think when you look at when you do look at these other kind of important thinking skills that I talk about in my book, so things like critical thinking, so just being able to identify the logical fallacies in an argument and the ability to be open-minded and to question your own assumptions and to kind of look for evidence that question your assumptions. Actually, that doesn't improve at all over the course of a university education. And actually, in some courses, it seemed to get worse. So I have no idea why that was, but in people studying business actually performed worse in critical thinking at the end of their degree than they did before. So that's quite, I think that might just be a kind of statistical outlier rather than saying something particular about that course. But the problem there really is just that you would hope with education that these skills would naturally improve, and they're not. And so I think that really does cause us to question how are we teaching these people and what are we teaching them to do? And I think in lots of courses we're still just teaching people to make a convincing argument in a kind of way that is quite similar to that motivated reasoning. So you can score really well on an essay in the UK by kind of coming up with an opinion beforehand and then just finding the evidence to support that opinion and kind of demolishing the evidence that questions it. And I think we need to kind of move away from that a little bit more. So we need to reward people for intellectual humility and for nuance in their arguments and for kind of recognizing things like uncertainty. It should be a good thing in an essay if you're actually acknowledging that the complexity is beyond a 2,000-word essay. But I don't think we do reward people for that at the moment. And I think then that leads to these kind of greater problems later on in life.
Yeah, I think mainstream media is not doing us any favors there either, because mainstream media is just looking for things at the extremes. They want sound bites and simple answers and screaming headlines, and there isn't much room for nuance. There's just black and white and yelling and screaming and the house is on fire. And so it's very difficult for people, I think, to even feel comfortable presenting nuanced discussions about anything. It's just all right. It's all left. It's black and white. And it's really, I find it really frustrating because I feel like almost everything must land somewhere in the murky middle. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about politics or whether you're talking about foreign relations or whatever. There just can't be simple answers to these complex problems like the environment or international affairs. It just can't be as simple as top 10 reasons why we should exit the EU or whatever. It can't be that simple.
Yeah. I totally agree. Yeah.
Talk to me about a fixed versus a growth mindset. I know that you've done work around this, and a number of people are talking about this in terms of keeping yourself agile and not falling into the intelligence trap.
So I'd say the growth mindset it proved to be very effective in the lab in the short term for improving people's kind of learning, because it helps you to overcome challenge. You kind of relish challenge rather than seeing it as a threat. And if you fail, if you have a growth mindset, failure isn't necessarily seen as reflecting something innate within you. You kind of see it more as a reflection maybe of the effort or the strategy that you've used, and you always see that there's a possibility to kind of improve in other ways. So, you can kind of see that the obstacles are movable rather than seeing them as kind of fixed and a reflection of yourself. Now, in education, it's quite difficult to apply that effectively. So there's still a question about exactly how we should be applying this in schools. But what I was really excited about was to see this new research showing that actually it's not just about learning, but people who have a growth mindset are also less susceptible to the intelligence trap, and especially to that kind of motivated reasoning that I mentioned before. And that kind of makes sense, because if you have a growth mindset and you're not so scared of mistakes or failures, because you can always see the potential for growth and learning. And so that means that if you come across something that questions your belief in something like climate change, for instance, you don't feel so personally threatened by that. And so you're actually just more open to the contradictory evidence and to pursue that line further. So in that way, it works a little bit like the trait of curiosity that I mentioned. It means that you can actually just open your mind to new information in a way that people with a fixed mindset, people who see failure as a big personal threat, just don't do. They would rather cling on to a belief that's wrong than kind of admit that they have made a mistake in the past in believing that thing. So I'm really encouraged by that. And I still have a lot of optimism about the way that the growth mindset could be applied in schools. I think the best way, personally, for people to think about it now is to just be a little bit more aware of when they have a growth or a fixed mindset, and to just kind of, I do it all the time, I think, so I live in Spain now and I'm learning Spanish, and, it's quite easy to get depressed if you, make a stupid mistake in an interaction or something. And now, having, looked into the growth mindset and the fixed mindset, I just kind of can see where I'm maybe seeing that as a personal threat to my identity, and just try to change my mindset a little bit to focus on the growth and the potential for growth. And so I think that's the better way maybe of thinking about the growth mindset, is to look at it kind of in the context of the problem that you're facing, rather than looking for a kind of one-size-fits-all approach to cultivating the growth mindset in education.
In the past 10 years, there's been a lot of writing and books and research and Google Talks and things about EQ as well, emotional intelligence. And I'm curious what your thoughts are looking at this from a 360 perspective.
Yeah, so I think there have been some criticisms of the emotional quotient tests, in that, so one problem was that the tests are maybe just a bit they simplify complex emotional situations, and you're kind of, in a way, you're rewarded sometimes for giving, how can I say this, for almost just conforming to what the kind of average answer would be across a group. But it could be that you have amazing emotional intelligence, but you're just giving a very innovative answer that is still marked down because it's not the kind of standard answer that most people would give. So I think the tests themselves maybe shouldn't be used in recruitment, certainly not as the kind of deciding factor. But I think more generally, we do still know that these kinds of social skills, social perceptiveness is so important for people's success throughout life. And especially in a group dynamic, you can actually see that people's how perceptive people are to the other members of the team is far more important than the average IQ of the team, or even the highest IQ within the group. So, we still know there's definitely a place for emotional intelligence in our understanding of decision-making. And so if I just talk a little bit more about that group decision-making work, actually what you see there is, say within a group, the average speaking time of each person is really important. So if every single person has a roughly equal amount of time to speak and contribute to the group, that is demonstrates a much better group dynamic than So if you have one person dominating the group. And so I think in business and organizations, it's those kinds of things we should be looking at, is just to see, like, do people kind of listen well? Do they help others to kind of share their opinions too? It's all of those kinds of skills that are really important. And you might not be able to measure that very accurately on one particular test, but it's certainly something that you can observe well as a manager and try to implement strategies that can correct for a problem if you do see one.
Yeah, people always say the quality of your life is the quality of your relationships, and I think that's probably true, and it definitely seems like your social ability is much more valuable there than your intellectual ability. But like you said, it's a very difficult thing to quantify because all of us can think of someone who we know who's just really, really skilled emotionally. And it's very hard to pinpoint. Of course, they're a good listener. Of course, they do these kinds of things. But at the same time, there's a whole bunch of other things that are just very difficult. People handle things very differently. Some people wear their emotions on their sleeve. Some people are just, when the time is right, they're very vocal about their needs, or they understand other people's needs. It's a very difficult thing to pin down. It's not like an aptitude test or something like that. But for sure, when I think about people that I really admire, not just in one area of life, but who've kind of got things figured out, usually somebody with a really high, I don't know if I'd even use the word emotional intelligence, but definitely social emotional skills, I guess, is what it would boil down to. And that seems like a very, very challenging thing to quantify, and certainly a challenging thing to teach.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in business, for say like some of the kind of standard emotional intelligence tests maybe aren't so great for the reasons I described. But I think still in business, if you're interviewing someone, just asking, like presenting them with like a standard kind of scenario that you would see in that particular job, and just say, like, how would you try to overcome this particular problem with, say, a coworker who isn't collaborating, or that kind of just kind of getting a sense of what people's strategies would be is still really valuable, I think, even if you don't want to put a kind of number on it in the same way that we put a number on IQ, for instance.
David, I love this work. I love what you're doing. For people who are listening who would like to pick up your book and follow you, where's the best place for us to send them?
So that would be either to my website, davidrobson.me, or my book's available on Amazon and all kinds of online retailers, and hopefully in most bookshops as well. And you could also follow me on Twitter. So my Twitter handle is D_A_Robson. That's ROBSON.
Right now, we have about 10,000 yoga trapeze students for every one teacher. What that ratio means is there's a huge opportunity for teachers right now. We started training professional teachers back in 2016, about 2.5 years ago. And since then, this course has really been a force of nature. We've had courses, of course, in Barcelona, our home base, in Manila, in Amsterdam, in Georgia, and in California, in Olympia, Washington, and in Virginia, and even in Hong Kong. We've been having this course all around the world, and I'm very excited to announce that we now have an online opportunity as well. It's not in lieu of the in-person course, it's in conjunction with the in-person course, but you can do one or you can do both courses together. It's a very popular course. We are now going into our round 4, our class number 4. We're accepting applications. To learn more, go to yogatrapezeonline.com. I'd encourage you to check out some of the stories from past graduates. You can see the full curriculum there and see if it's right for you. This week's nutritional tip is in response to a listener question, and listener Lucy says, "Hey Lucas, I know that many years ago you lost a bunch of weight with yoga and raw food. Is that how you would suggest other people lose weight in 2020? Lucy, it's not how I would recommend most people go about weight loss. The question of how to lose weight is kind of an impossible one. It's a very individual one, and there are so many variables, including your age and your lifestyle and pre-existing conditions and level of activity. But I don't want to give you a runaround answer, so why don't we just talk about some principles that are applicable to almost everybody listening who might want to lose weight. And the first big one is that you want to go slow. Now, I know that sounds hypocritical because I lost a bunch of weight very, very quickly, kind of too quickly, but I was really young, right? I was in my early 20s. And if you look at people who make these radical transformations, they're very often really young. When you're older, it just doesn't happen as quickly. And to give you an example of this that all of you will be able to relate to, I'm sure everyone listening knows someone who had kids or a child very young, like age 20, for example. And that new mom, 2 months after she gave birth, looked like a teenager again, right? This is the power of youth. When you're 35 years old and you give birth, it's very rare that 2 months after, 2 months postpartum, you're back to your old self. You just don't recover as quickly. The same is true for injuries and for workouts and for exercise and muscle building. It just, with age, things slow down. And that's depressing at first, but then if you just appreciate it and stop and just say, hey, listen, it's a different phase of life. If I'm looking to lose a significant amount of weight, I need to think of months and maybe even a year plus. A lot of people listening to this show might need to lose, 20, 30 pounds plus. That might be an over a 1-year journey. That's the challenging news. The good news is you can feel really good the whole way, and you can be setting yourself up for a real lifestyle, not just a diet that could really serve you long term. So that would be my first advice, is plan to go slowly, like really, really slow down. The other thing that we talk a lot about on the show when it comes to nutrition is make sure that you start off with macro thinking. Meaning don't get lost in the weeds with raspberry ketones and spirulina and all this kind of stuff. Those are wonderful, interesting micronutrients, nutrientism focus, but it's not going to make the big difference. You need to get things like your stress and your sleep dialed in. You need to focus on meal timing and then just macronutrients in terms of fats, proteins, and carbs. Getting all that stuff dialed in. And then the other things will really fall into line a lot easier. The last thing, and again, these are just very global principles, but they're important to understand, is that in almost all cases, exercise is not the deciding factor. If you were to break it down, it's something like 80% diet and 20% exercise. And exercise is a big, broad, generic term, which could mean something as simple as walking in the evening for 30 minutes, or it could be something as hardcore as a CrossFit WOD. But it's not going to make the biggest difference, surprisingly, for weight loss. And if you don't believe me, go to one of these 24-hour gyms, 24-hour fitness or Anytime Fitness or any of these things, and peek in the window, and you'll see most of the people in there are carrying extra weight. They're going to the gym every day, and they're carrying extra weight. Why? Because mostly your body composition is made in the kitchen, and things you do with exercise and physical movement and things like that amplify it. It's incredibly important. I don't want to ever dissuade somebody from exercise. Any type of movement you do is so fantastic. And in fact, the mental health benefits might even outweigh the physical benefits in the short term. And when you get your head in order, oftentimes that helps you get your body in order. But it's really important to put things in their place, because oftentimes I meet people who are looking to lose weight and they sign up for something really extreme, then they hurt their knees, and it becomes this vicious cycle. In many cases, again, macro thinking, committing to a long-term plan, really taking a simple approach and a really moderate approach so that you don't end up, 3 months from now with a torn meniscus and frustration and even more weight than you started with. There are lots and lots of other things to think about when it comes to weight loss. But again, just starting with those kind of first principles, I think, can be really helpful.
Hi, Lucas. My name is Kathy. I'm a yoga teacher, and I absolutely love your podcast and look forward to it every week. So thank you so much for putting it out there. My question is around, involuntary movement in a pose. Almost like convulsions. I wouldn't say they were that convulsions per se, but like mini convulsions. I had a student, a gentleman, he was in his early 30s, very fit, first time doing yin. I was doing yin and restore, so we did about 2 or 3 yin poses. Coming into a restorative pose, it was a restorative back bend block underneath the sacrum and just lying down, very gentle, and his body started convulsing. And he called me over and he said, "It feels like a release. I think I'm detoxing because I've been so stressed out. It doesn't hurt at all. It just looks weird." He was literally looked like he was possessed. He was coming out of his skin a little bit. Never seen it before. I've taught a lot of yin over the years, a lot of restorative. I mean, certainly shaking in a yang practice if you're holding a pose or something, but never this. Wondering if you had any experience with this in the past, and if so, any advice you give me as a teacher. I told him I wasn't a doctor, and I certainly couldn't make any comments on it. I'm just wondering if I should tell him to come out of the pose if that's the case, or perhaps yin is not for him. Just curious about it. Also curious about what is behind it. Is it a detox? Is it his body releasing a lot of stress? Any advice would be really appreciated. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Hey, Kathy, thanks for listening and thanks for the question. This kind of thing I've seen quite often in yoga classes. Not so much what you're talking about, but definitely emotional releases, definitely uncontrolled movements and things like that. Usually it's very short-lived, but not necessarily. A few years ago, I had a guest on the podcast, Maria Alfaro. It's episode 226, and the name of the show is Neurogenic Yoga for Stress. Neurogenic Yoga for Stress. And Maria is using TRE, tension and trauma releasing exercises, with her yoga classes to create this big release. I had a couple of different TRE people on the show around that same time. Again, back in episode 226, if you go back, you'll be able to find it really easily on the website. And essentially what they do is they use this system. It's self-induced tremors, essentially. And it sounds very woo-woo. I'm always really skeptical of all of this stuff because there's a huge population of people out there preying on people with trauma and problems, and we've all got those, and so it just feels very predatory. But this is very different. I started using this after I had a couple of people on the show. I started using these TRE exercises, these trauma and tension releasing exercises, with these very simple yoga poses. So what you do is these very specific set of yoga poses. They're not complicated at all. They're just designed to fatigue your muscles to the point of twitching, and then you essentially lie on your back in kind of a Supta Baddha Konasana, essentially like a reclining butterfly pose, but with your knees up off the ground. And your knees just kind of start to tremble. And the theory behind it is that this tremoring, this shaking, this full body shake in a controlled environment is really healthy. And the analogy that they use is like an animal, like a dog trembling, or like when you see kids stimming, self-stimulation, when they wag hands or things like this. You'll see this more pronounced, of course, with autistic children and things like this. But all of us do it to some extent. You know, like if you're nervous, you'll bounce your foot or you'll tap your pen. And the idea is when you do these full body, or in the case of TRE yoga, when I was doing this, mostly lower body, but they're big muscle groups. You know, your entire legs are kind of trembling. You get this emotional release. I did this every day for, I don't know how long it was, but it was at least 3 weeks. I was going through a rough time emotionally, just kind of overwhelmed with anxiety and stuff like that. And none of my usual tricks were working. And so I tried something new, and I really got a lot of benefits from it. And I haven't spoken enough about it, and I appreciate the reminder. I should go back and bring some of this back on the show, but I'd really encourage people to check it out. It's basically free. There's no cost to it. You can learn how to do it pretty much just from listening to these podcasts. And it's just a really effective way to kind of self-soothe. TRE, it's called Trauma and Tension Releasing Exercises, and then Neurogenic Yoga with Maria Alfaro. She's the one who's kind of incorporated this into a systematized yoga practice. But again, don't be confused. It's not complicated, nothing you have to worry about. It's very, very safe and very simple to use. So if you'd like to learn more, that's kind of where I would point you, in the direction that I point you. Hope that's helpful. Thanks for listening.
This week's iTunes review is by Clara Jansova. Clara Jansova says, "This is easily my favorite podcast to put things into perspective. I'm currently pursuing a master's in occupational therapy, and all of the science-based information can get overwhelming and lose its life application in a school-based setting. Your podcast helps me focus on the full picture, especially the take-home points you always ask your guests. It helps zoom out of all the never-ending detailed information and focus on what you can actually put into practice in your life. Thanks and keep making more. Been here listening since the start and they just keep getting better." Thank you, Clara Jansova. You have won the Yoga Trapeze. Email us at podcast@yogabuddy.com and we will ship it to you.
If you're a regular Yoga Talk Show listener, you'll definitely want to get on my email list. Go to yogabuddy.com/sign me up. When you enter your email address there, we always have free giveaways every month. Yoga straps, water bottles, discounts in our shop, and all kinds of other things. When you sign up at yogabuddy.com/sign me up, I'll send you just one email a week with updates about the show, special offers, new courses, and valuable information that I think you'll find useful. So go to yogabuddy.com/sign me up to claim your free prize now.